Hello, Global Theater. My name is Jerry Fialka. Today is June 21, 2022. We want to thank Rob Grant and his amazing podcast. I'm probably wrong about everything. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with Carl Henry Elsaesser. I know I killed it. Carl, say your last name so we have it down correctly.
Elsaesser. You're pretty
Elsaesser.
good. Mhm.
Elsaesser. Carl, it's an honor and a pleasure to be here with you. Where are you calling in from?
I'm calling him from Brooklyn. I sort of live between Maine and Brooklyn these days.
Gotcha. And first question is, what is the best thing for a human being?
Slowing down? That would be my
Oh,
answer.
I like that. I never get that answer.
I don't believe that.
No, I'm telling you, I don't get that. I mean, I sort of try to remember 40 years every answer.
Mhm.
The typical answer or the answer I get the most is love. So it's like it's all
Uh,
good. So, what's your favorite form of information, how it comes into you?
oh, good question. Does talking count, or hanging out with friends, or meeting new
Sure.
people?
Sure. That's like, well, we call it direct experience, but talking, meeting
Direct
new people.
experience. Exactly.
Yeah.
That's exactly
Meeting
right.
new people. I love that. I try to meet new people every day.
Yeah.
Why do you think humans collect or gather information?
Hmm. Hmm. I would say that my assumption is, or in my personal experience, it's some way of contextualizing my own sense of self and some kind of existential question of why.
Yeah. That's good. And you get it. There's no rush here. If you need to think, you
Okay.
know, it's we're mellow here. We're slowed down.
Yeah, let's slow it down.
Even though this is live TV
Mhm.
across the universe,
Mhm.
it's slow. And do you think this need or want to collect information is more innate or more invented?
Innate.
Yeah. Do thoughts create emotions?
Hmm. I mean, not all emotions, but I do think they do create emotions, or maybe they amplify emotions. What's the difference? I don't know.
That's one of my favorite things about these interviews is you put the question in the context you want, and more so, you can reword the verbs I use. Like
Mm.
taking that, do thoughts create emotions?
They
There's
amplify emotions.
amplify is a great word. All right. I don't know what I think until I fill in the blank.
I don't know what I think until hmm. It's like until I do something wrong or like make a mistake. I don't know what I think until I've probably failed 40 times, you know?
That is great. Super. Well, I got it from McLuhan says, I don't know what I think until I say it. Joan Didion says, I don't know what I think until I write it. But that was good.
I don't know what I think until I fail. That's usually
That
how it
is that
goes.
is a great answer. I love that. Can humans think without language?
Yeah, 100%. But
Yeah.
it's a different kind of thinking. It's a
Yeah.
thinking that sort of involves like all of the senses that are nonverbal. And thinking is sometimes not verbal too, so, there's that.
Yeah. Well, that's Chomsky says a language is not just words. It's culture, a tradition, a unification of community, a whole history that creates what a community is.
Right. I agree with that.
Carl, yeah, Carl, what do you do when language breaks down, when language doesn't work?
That's where I'm at my best. That's like I feel like I exist best between the sort of gaps of articulate language. So I sort of, those are the moments that I kind of look for, and usually the moments where I sort of feel most centered is the moments where language breaks down. Is that the language you used?
Yeah, that's good. Well, your observations of humans in general, I know it's both, but are we more thinking beings or more feeling beings?
Mm. I don't know. Um, it feels at the moment that we're kind of more, we're not feeling beings, or maybe we are. I don't know. It seems like at the moment we're more thinking beings without feeling.
Yeah.
But I don't know. Yeah, I mean, that's a hard one to place your finger on.
These are two questions from Alan Turing in 1950s. Is
Hmm.
thinking a function of the soul?
I hope so. Um, yeah, I think I hope so. I think that's a beautiful way of putting it, and it seems like when I feel most centered with my thoughts, or when I feel most grounded with my thoughts, it's coming from this like non-place of the soul. So yeah, I think that's right. It can get carried away though, right? You know, thinking is its own machine, right? So there are times when it's aligned with the soul, and I feel that it's true there. But there is quickly times when the machine runs away with itself.
Dude, you have ESP because the next Turing question is, can machines think?
Mm. Yes, I'm going to say yes, definitively.
No, I love how you were using the word machine as a metaphor, weren't
Right.
you? Yeah. Do you more pursue happiness or more pursue meaning?
Meaning, 100%. I wish I pursued happiness more. I think I'd be happier.
But you know what? I got that from Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. He says meaning usually lasts, happiness doesn't.
Yeah. I feel like my soul has deepened in the pursuit of meaning, for sure, if we're going to go there. And I feel like a more whole human, but I definitely feel like I definitely tend to privilege this pursuit of something called meaning with my art practice or my general ways of existing in the world than something along the lines of pleasure or happiness.
Does the brain more detect consciousness or create it? Like, is consciousness there bubbling away and we're detecting it, or are we creating it?
I think it exists outside of us. So yeah, I think it's there and it's bubbling, and we sort of come in contact with it at moments, you know, moments of connection. And it takes time, right? It's like hard to tune into that, and it's usually kind of rare, you know, in my experience.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, but I do. Whenever I do, I feel like it's this experience of coming in contact with something that's outside of my own creation. So I would 100% say that.
What's faster, speed of light or speed of thought?
Ooh. Um, I think speed of light. I know how fast my thinking is. I've witnessed and watched and slowed down enough to sort of literally watch and feel my thoughts come and go. And it's fucking fast. Oh, I don't know if I can there.
Yeah, you can say whatever you want. That's great.
But I just feel like light is faster.
For a guy who said slowing down, that was great. Maybe I should reword it. What's slower, speed of thought or speed of light?
Yeah, that's a good one.
Audre Lorde, the poet, said, "You can't dismantle the master's house using the master's tools." Yvonne Rainer responded, said, "You can if you expose the tools." What new tool do you suggest? And just to put it in context, Carl, it's like this. It's basically, what tool do you gravitate towards? If you want to put new, like I'm asking, that's fine. And if you want to apply it to the cute quotes I put before any of these questions, that's up to you. You know, what new tool do you suggest to dismantle the master's house, or just what tool do you gravitate towards?
Um, I feel like in some degrees, like this is a question of like tear it all down and start from scratch, or sort of spend time. Is there any worth in spending time with the master's tools? And I have to say that I do think there is some worth that comes from spending time understanding the master's tools. So, in terms of a new tool, I feel like it'd be, I don't know. It's like, I find that the only way in which I found a sense of liberation in my practice and in my sense of self is through understanding the past that has come before me in terms of the masters that I'm working within. And so I feel like it's a tool that's based on the past masters' tools. Maybe it's a tool that by knowing my master's tools so thoroughly dismantles them, right? But it's like an intelligence that comes from understanding the intelligence of what came before.
It's really well put. It's like Harold Bloom's The Anxiety of Influence. It's like
Mm.
you study Chantal Ackerman and Douglas Sirk so much, you absorb their mastery, then you abandon it. It's like, good luck. How do you abandon that? That's
And you drop it off at the train station, right? It's like you go to the final train station and then you're let off, and then you go from there.
you drop it off. That was good. We'll get into that more. What do you worry about when you go to bed at night?
Ooh. I've been having a reoccurring dream or nightmare that someone's breaking into my apartment and going to murder me, but that's very specific. So I don't know about the like larger questions. Usually it's some form of bodily terror, like will my body wake up in the morning or not?
Yeah. So McLuhan learned from Ezra Pound that artists are the antenna of the race. And when I'm saying artists, I mean filmmakers, literature, painting.
Mm.
The artists are broadcasting and detecting the hidden psychic effects of our inventions so
Mm.
that we can learn how to cope with what we don't like about the inventions.
Mm.
So I asked you the question McLuhan probed his whole career. Why do humans ignore the hidden psychic effects of our inventions, even though the artists are broadcasting them to us?
I mean, isn't that kind of obvious?
Well, just tell me what do you think?
I mean, money, capitalism, like, come on. It's, the information era, like, of course that's always going to be the case. Like, there's no need to even pretend that something other is possible or, happens.
It's good. We're going to get in a lot of that. That was really beautiful. So why do artists have moral obligation?
Hmm. I have moral obligation, but I don't know if artists need to have moral obligation. I think that's the way I'd put that.
Yeah, it's good. Are you more afraid of new ideas or more afraid of old ideas?
Mm, mm, I think I'm more afraid of new ideas. I think
Yeah.
it takes a while for those to sort of come to me or to situate them.
Can you conjure up your earliest memory ever or one of them?
um, One of my earliest memories is the carpet in my childhood house when I was like 3 or 4 years old. It was a brown carpet. It was very shaggy, and I crawled around on it. And we were in that house until I was like 2 or 3 or 4. That's it. My parents like do not believe that I believe this, but I have a very textural memory of it.
Well, this is something I've noticed. Generally, it's visual that most people say it's something in the windows, but last couple people have said visual plus a tactile thing.
Yeah, very tactile. You
Yeah.
can feel it. Mhm.
Is memory more a curse or more a blessing?
Blessing.
Yeah. Tell me someone within your immediate family, then outside your immediate family, who had an impact on you like a role model, and what specifically, just briefly, was that impact?
Um, hmm. Um, mm, my dad is like a big wilderness guy, and he always used to sort of like to say to his children, never get backed into a corner. And I feel like I've sort of taken on that Protestant Catholic kind of comeuppings, take what you will mentality. And so I feel like to some degree he really influenced my sense of a pursuit of freedom that's tied to meaning, where I'm really invested in some kind of search for self placement, which I think he really pursued his whole life through nature. Um, and then outside of my family, I think it's I don't know. There's so many. Hmm, I think I had a mentor in grad school who really influenced me. His name was Mike Gibbeser. He's a really fantastic filmmaker, and he just always had this incredibly intense way of viewing work and sort of getting really good at articulating the kind of core of what we were watching. And I think that sort of really heightened my sense of a kind of framing for how to consider work. And he always used to have this phrase, which I think about a lot, which is like, what is the work of your images and sound? Like, what is the work that your images and sound are doing? What's the work happening here? And I think about that a lot when I make my own work.
Wow, that's really good. What is the work doing?
Yeah.
Yeah. And for you, you're like this search of self. And
Yeah.
so it's form and content, and then you. That was really beautiful, brought up a lot. Now, was he specifically teaching you filmmaking or experimental filmmaking or what? What was the subject?
Experimental, like nonfiction ethnographic,
Yeah.
but also experimental. It was grad school. It was really broad. I was working on my own stuff.
Yeah. Were you raised a particular religion?
Catholic baby.
Me too. Did you check out at a certain age?
Yeah, 100%.
What what age about?
Pretty much around senior year of high school or junior year, maybe even earlier, maybe sophomore year.
Yeah. And do you pray?
No, I don't pray anymore.
What would you want God to say to you if God exists? What would you like God to say to you after you die?
I don't. I had this thought the other day that I wonder if, like, you know, how there's, God has sort of been like people like to say that he's been sort of usurped by a religious right, that like, that sort of validates
Yeah.
violence and whatever. I sort of had this epiphany the other day, or this like thought the other day, of like, what if they're right? Like, what if God does hate gay people, and what if like God is super racist and like all these things are true, and which like kind of just further kind of solidifies my desire of like killing God if God was alive,
That's great. If
like
God
maybe what if we just give it? Like, what if we just give God away? Give it to all these people who want to claim him, and let God sort of identify with all the things that they say. So I don't know if I'd let God speak to me if I die.
that Carl, that is truly amazing because you got to hear this. Harold Bloom
Yeah.
wrote, do you they asked him just before he died, like a year or two ago, they asked him, or several years ago, they go, do you believe in God? He said, my attitude toward Yahweh is that I don't like him and I don't trust him and I wish he'd go away.
Yeah.
But I know he won't because he's built into the language, as Nietzsche said. He's the part of the way we think. As soon as you use a verb involving being, you're in trouble.
Yeah.
That's like, I wish you'd go away.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
That was good. Good answer. Okay. How do you advise someone to deal with an enemy? This one I'm going to set up with a few modern thinkers' thoughts. Alan Watts says, if you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them. Coppola stole from the mob and the samurais, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. JFK said, forgive your enemy, but don't aim. Fellini says, I need an enemy. It's a lot of thoughts. The basic question is, Carl, how do you advise someone to deal with an enemy? But first, how would you respond to Alan Watts? If you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them.
I don't I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. I feel like you can acknowledge them without empowering them. That's my personal belief. And how I personally would deal with
Yeah,
my
how would you advise someone to deal with an enemy?
yeah, I don't that's a tough one. I feel like my MO with dealing with my enemies is to basically become extremely passive and let them trample over me and let them do what they will to my body or to my ego or to my sense of self. That's usually been the way that I sort of do it. There's like I feel like I've found a kind of like grace or empowerment is maybe too strong a word, and be like in the power of passivity,
Yeah.
where if you let someone like a train run its course, eventually it's going to run out of steam. And so, you can find strength in kind of the resiliency of letting someone do what they're going to do.
Yep. James Joyce was the first projectionist in Dublin over 100 years ago. He basically checked out. He said, this is stupid. Why should I go inside a building and see a movie of a tree when I can go outside and see a real tree? Years later, Faulkner said sometimes the best fiction is more true than journalism. Why do we have to recreate things in order to get them? Why do we have to go to a theatrical play of people acting out life? Why don't we just live life?
Um, I think I've been working with films for a while now. I'm still pretty young, but I feel like I've been working in this medium for a decent while now. And I feel like I'm more and more coming into a kind of alignment that like representation or fictionality or narrativity or this thing called art that we make isn't, is like its own world. It doesn't I don't even see the tether to reality. The tether is like very complicated. It's not a mirror, it's not a window, it's like something that's some deformed beautiful monster of its own creation. And I think there's a lot of excitement for me and liberation that comes from allowing a kind of play to exist outside of the space of reality. And I feel like I do both things simultaneously. Like the pursuit of life is one thing and the pursuit of art is another. And the two maybe have some kind of perverse relationship to each other, but they're not reflections of each other.
Really good. You brought up a lot. What do you mean by the word tether?
Like some kind of connection.
Oh,
Like,
yeah.
obviously there's some form of connection between films that I make and the reality of the subjecthood that I am exploring, right? Or the subjects that I'm exploring. But I'm more interested in like, instead of tracking down those relationships or those tethers, I'm more interested in responding to this fictional space or this space called art or this space called film that I'm engaging with and seeing where it can go separate
Right.
from reality and letting the kind of tethers or the connections exist as they will,
Yeah. Well,
Does that
yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
does that make sense?
Oh yeah, you're anticipating all these questions, but before I ask you the question that specifically addresses what you just said,
Mhm.
walk me through how you got to film. Did you grow up? You're in wilderness, kind of seeing nature. are your parents taking you to big movies on the screen? Are you watching cable TV? Where did you basically walk me through? Would you study? Did you go to school to study art and film? And what was the tipping point when you go, oh, that's what I want to do? That's what I want to pursue.
Um, let's see. I always loved movies. We had this insanely incredible movie store in our hometown called Bart and Greg's DVD Explosion, and it was this dungeness store that like had every single DVD, in existence, with wonderfully curated sections by Bart and Greg and the other employees. And it was like I found that, I remember finding that in like junior high and starting to explore the collection and just having this entire world open up for me. I think there was a relationship to growing up in a like capital L liberal town and being a queer kid and not really fitting in, and finding, as I think a lot of gay and queer people do, some kind of refuge in like the weirdness of cinema. For a while, I thought I was going to be an actor, and so I like pursued acting for a while, and then I realized that there was a lot more control and power with the things that were behind the camera instead of in front of the camera. And so I think I started making films in high school, and just kind of pursued it from there.
But you're making films that are like Hollywood. Were you watching Hollywood? Were you watching European art films? Were you watching experimental films? What were you watching where you go, I want to do that?
I didn't watch any experimental films until, or I watched Psycho Symbiote Taxoplasm, whatever that film is called,
Yeah.
the Bill Reeves film, when I was like in high school and being like, what the hell is this? But also loving it. But I didn't watch any experimental film until I went to college. So I was watching I was going through like the Sight and Sound top 200 films and the European art house films, but also a lot of like, I was obsessed with Paul Thomas Anderson and,
Right.
Terrence Malick, like the traditional kind of big male figures. And so the films that I were making were a combination of music videos. I really loved making music videos to really emotional music like Sigur Rós. I have like a string of Sigur Rós music videos. I mean, and music videos were fantastic because it's like the perfect first step towards experimental film, right? You can do whatever you can and match it to a track, and there you go, So that's
so you were making these on VHS or on
Yeah.
You were digitally editing too?
Mini DV tapes, and I had like a program that came with,
You could edit. Yeah.
I bought, that was like a very, very rudimentary editing program, and that's what I used. Yep.
So then what did you study when you went to college?
I studied film. I went to Hampshire College, and as you know, there's like a huge lineage of experimental film there. I studied with Abraham Rivette and Baba Hillman primarily, and they're both really fantastic experimental filmmakers and teachers, and they really exposed me to a lot of experimental film that I undeniably hated the entire time while I was watching. And even
Did you really?
I hated it. I thought it was so stupid. I thought this was like the stupidest thing that could ever possibly exist.
What put you over to being
I was resistant to it. I learned through resistance. Like generally, it's like I don't like the things that I grow to love. I tend to hate the things that I grow to love, and so something that I've learned over a long time, that resistance is usually a good indicator of further investigation for me. Yeah. But so I was extremely resistant to it. I thought it was stupid. I hated it. I remember seeing Window Water Baby moving and thinking that it was like one of the worst movies that could have ever been possibly made.
You're not wrong. It is funny what you're saying because it's all true in a way.
Right.
But wait, I got to go back one step. When did you, because, we did have an encounter because you transcribed my Bill Brand interview. That's like 20 or 30 years ago, it seems. But when did you study with him or did you work with him?
Yeah, no, Bill was my advisor too. Yeah.
And
It was Bill, Abraham, and Baba. Those were the three primary people I worked with.
so anyways, then you got into making on your own. Okay, so we'll go into that. Now, a screenwriting teacher told me great film, great art is when you can clearly see the intention of the maker. Kubrick says great art is when you can clearly not see the intention of the maker. What role does intention play in your creative process?
I mean, it's like every intention is everything to me, but not in terms of its perception by the viewer. Like, the best for me is when you cannot figure out how someone did something. That to me is like where this thing called movie magic comes from, right? So it's like the like intention is, again, if we're getting back to this metaphor of the tools, it's like there's this, I forget this poet, and I always bastardize this like quote, but there's this quote about how like the best art or the best poem simultaneously makes the tools to write the poem, and in the act of writing the poem destroys the tools. And that's the way I've always sort of felt about art in my practice, where it's like I will spend weeks and months doing this extremely small, detailed thing. So there's the perception of incredibly clear understanding, accessible, but once you start thinking about it, you really cannot figure out how something happened.
Man, you covered so many things in that little part, Carl. That was amazing. Because the first one was, Jay Rosenblatt. Um, you know his films? Anyways, you know Jay's
Mm-mm,
films? Okay,
mm-mm,
anyways, you should check him out.
mm-mm,
He's been a darling of Ann Arbor for years, and he's a great filmmaker, and he got a short film nominated for an Oscar this year,
so
which is like one of the Ann Arbor crew, like you are, getting nominated for an Oscar. It's
great.
still pretty cool. I said, how did Chris Marker influence you? Because it's evident. He says, it's how I imagined Chris Marker made Sans Soleil. It wasn't Jay going, I've studied all the books and they told me how Chris Marker made this. It doesn't matter. It's how he
Yeah,
imagined. So
yeah,
I think it goes to your thing. You can't figure out how it was made. I saw what's his name? Ken Jacobs interviewed once live all the smart assy film experimental film people in LA, and one goes, how'd you make that? And he goes, I'm not gonna tell you.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, 90% of the work, right, is like hiding your secrets, you know? If painters don't show you how they're going to paint a painting, why do filmmakers have to talk about their technical?
So you kind of answered it, but I'm going to ask it anyways. Marcel Duchamp said there's no art without an audience. How much are you thinking of your audience when you're making your film?
I mean, the notion of an audience has super evolved for me over time, from complete anarchy to thinking like I don't make films for any artist or any audience other than myself, to thinking that I hate an audience and this film is meant to destroy an audience, to like coming around to a more ambivalent sense of, I guess, again, the word grace, where it's like there's an audience, they exist. This film to me exists with or without an audience. I am really interested in the ways in which I can play with a concept of this sort of evolving audience and their projections onto a cinema space, and what I can do with that and in elements of the work that I do. But at the end of the day, I always try to like, the work is for, the work works for itself outside of an audience. So again, it's this kind of ambiguous relationship, in the same way we were talking about the art and reality. A proxy for that, right, is the artist and the audience.
Yeah, it's really good. You use the word grace there, Grace. Suss that out a little. I didn't quite understand how that word worked in your description. What
Uh,
is grace and what were you meaning with it? Yeah.
Grace has always been a really important word for me, as one who grew up Catholic. But it's like a kind of surrender to something that you can't control or define, and being at peace with it, right? So, I think I've made films that tried to control and define what an audience was. And I think I've made films that tried to control and define what the film was. And I think grace and learning the kind of impossibilities of both of these forms of control leads to a sense of surrender, and that surrender has an emotion to it. It can be a violent surrender, it can be a angry surrender, it can be a defiant surrender, and then there's this other form of surrender that happens with grace, which is a kind of peaceful surrender, or an intentional surrender, right? So I think that I'm interested in struggling through controlling my films and being intentional with them, and struggling through thinking about an audience and playing with their perceptions, but also always getting to this place where like a sense of surrender comes, in my own practice. And hopefully that's felt in the films as well.
Yeah. Two things you brought that really evoked. One is I've heard this line about once the artist creates their art, it's no longer theirs. It's the audience. They can do whatever they want with it. Any feelings on that?
To me, it's once the art is made, it's no longer the audience, or it's no longer the artists, but it's also no longer the audiences. It's just the objects. Like,
oh my God, that's heavy.
Like that's, to me, that's my goal. And that gets at that sense of like, hiding your intention, right? Is when you make an object that is complete to itself, it exists between an audience and an artist in its own way. And so that's my goal. It's an impossible goal. I know it's an impossible goal, but that's usually my goal. And that's
I'm screwed because this whole 90-minute interview pinnacles at one question. You've already answered that question like twice, but I'm gonna still ask it at the end because it's so cool, and you'll freak out because you probably know the essence of it from the quote, blah, blah, blah. But the journey, the cliche is the journey's more important than the destination. Why do we have to name or seek a destination if the journey's more important?
Wait, will you say that again? I got distracted.
The cliche goes, the journey is more important than the destination.
Yeah.
Why do we have to seek or name a destination if the journey's more important?
I don't know if we do have to seek a destination. I don't know if I believe that. I feel like, again, I'm like, trying to sort of translate these questions in part to my practice, right? Or to a film. And I don't think my favorite films or my own practices seek to put a period at the end of the work, right? Yeah. So I don't know if I believe that statement at the end.
Well, no, because I asked it doesn't mean I believe it.
I know.
No, because that's psychogeography. That's flaneur. That's the people who changed art forever in Paris. They just sat around, drank coffee, and didn't do anything. McLuhan says everything we invent extends some humanness. So clothing extends our skin, knife and fork extends our teeth. The shutter in a camera or a projector extends our eyelid. Even non-tangible like religion or philosophy extends consciousness or whatever. What does the moving image camera extend for you? Whether it's analog or digital, capturing 16 millimeter Bolex or a cell phone, what does the moving image camera extend for you? What humanness?
I mean, again, it's like depends for how I'm using it in the context of the film. It's gone anywhere from a very one-to-one ratio of the vision and the eye. It's gone as deep as the soul. It's gone to something more conceptual along a politic, right? But it depends in the positioning of the camera in the edit, So for me, I'm more interested in the ways in which the camera as an extension is an extension of like many, many things,
Right. Yeah.
And using all of those things, not actually limiting myself to one of those things, trying to define and then use that language to write something.
Yeah, you're a comprehensivist. You get the big picture. It's good. Like, because McLuhan had the great line, it's easy to say extends the eye, but McLuhan said, no, it extends the foot because you're traveling. And, it's not limited to just that. I'm not trying to say it's just one thing,
Of
but
course.
Barbara Hammer, have you seen this amazing movie called Beyond the Bolex?
I don't know if I have.
You've got to see it. You would know if you saw it. You got to see it. Write it down and check
Yeah,
it
yeah,
out. Barbara Hammer says the camera extends her shoulder,
yeah.
which is amazing because it is extending your hand and you're pointing. But, your
And it
body,
makes sense to me that like Barbara Hammerer would say something very definitive and also kind of amazing, like the
yeah,
shoulder, right?
yeah,
Because if you look at her work, all of her work does have this very individualistic, like specific energy about it, right?
yeah,
And it's like, and that's amazing. I think I'm more interested in taking like a Barbara Hamra and combining it with a Ken Jacobs, and then
yeah,
combining it with like, it's like, and seeing what happens when this like
yeah.
this almost index comes together.
Well, again, anticipating the next question, Peter Greenaway said cinema is much too rich a medium to be left to storytellers. Are experimental filmmakers telling stories a different way or doing something completely different? If me and you watch The Flicker by Tony Conrad right now, black and white frames flickering on and off, we might have a story go through our head, but that's not, what people think as traditional narrative. Even though Andrew Noren said it well, he said, if you put one frame after a next, that's narrative. So it's a tricky question and it's stupid, really. But, it is fun to start with Greenaway saying cinema is much too rich a medium to be left to storytellers because it's only a 130-year-old medium and it was hijacked by narrative. That's all we got, really, So
Yeah.
that. So just what your thoughts on this? Are experimental filmmakers telling stories a different way or doing something completely different?
I mean, I totally agree with the Greenaway quote.
Yeah,
Like, and I 100% am annoyed with the limitations of story on our medium, especially in the nonfiction realm, which seems completely bizarre to me. But there is also a difference between story and narrative, which is a very clear difference. And I do think a lot of cinema is invested in narrative, unless it's like intentionally resisting narrative. The Flicker is a good example, right?
who is
So
a good example?
the Flicker is a good example of
Oh,
a film that
The Flicker is a good example.
of resisting this thing called narrative and existing outside of this thing called story.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, yeah. So I mean, I get that. Like I get the notion that a frame in front of a frame is the definition of a narrative. Like I
yeah,
get that, but I don't agree.
yeah. No, I understand. I don't agree, and it's funny because no one ever tells me there's a difference between story and narrative. So I love you sussing that out,
Oh,
especially
there is 100%.
no, but in regards to this is funny because this is how Hollis Frampton says it.
Hmm.
Narrative is born among the animal necessities of the spirit because we are waiting to die.
Cool.
Yeah, it's like it is a great quote. But I mean, you can react to that Hollis quote, or you can just say, I mean, break it down a little more. What's the
Yeah.
difference between story and narrative? Yeah.
Um. Well, I mean, story has a plot, right? I mean, this is what a story has: a point A, a point B, a point C that's tied together through a thing called plot, which is like some form of time-based evolution of a thing, right? And that thing is wrapped up in, again, I keep wanting to fall back on story or plot, but that's like a story is a plot is a story. Narrative doesn't need plot, and narrative doesn't need story. Narrative is this thing that sort of gets more towards this Hollis Frampton concept of an innate making sense of the world, driven by something. You can call it the death drive, other people can call it grace, other people can call it God, other people can call it whatever, but it's some sense of a holistic meaning making machine, right? And so I think narrative is sort of carefully understanding that narrative happens, you know? And so it's like carefully observing the way narrative happens, frame after frame after frame that you're working with, and then either playing with that, ignoring it, rejecting it, or embellishing it, right? So I'm getting a little muddled in my differences here, but like story is plot is story, narrative is this far more open experience of the fact that we make meaning, and making meaning is the definition of narrative to me. And so once you can sort of pay attention to that, then are you there?
Yeah, no, I'm here. You just froze a little, but I can hear you. Yep.
There we go. Okay, cool. We're back.
Yeah, sometimes it freezes a little, but very rarely. We're pretty lucky how good this works. So no, that was really, I appreciate that. And back to the way, just to interject this question, the way Hollis says that is interesting because he's saying narrative is born out of this spirit that we're waiting to die. Carl, can you forget to die?
Yeah, totally.
Totally. You wouldn't believe how many people go like this. What does that mean? They can't handle that question. I appreciate it. Yeah, there's no right or wrong answers to any of these questions, but that one you got right. So let's say me and you are sitting with George Manupelli 61 years ago, and we're going to start the Ann Arbor Film Festival. Mm-hmm. Should we be more inclusive or more exclusive? And I'll just set it up. There's always a fraction of animation documentaries, but it's mainly experimental film. You've been there. Chick Strand was starting Canyon Cinema at the same time with Bruce Bailey in San Francisco. And she told me they were trying to recreate their 11-cent movie-going experience, show a newsreel or cartoon and then experimental. Brakhage came along and says, don't show that other stuff, just show experimental. So what would you lean towards more, inclusive or exclusive?
I mean, those are kind of loaded words, but I would lean more towards exclusive, in the sense that I think it's important to make spaces that have their own identity and their own kind of regionalism. And that regionalism isn't just geography, but it's also within an industry. And I think that's really nice when things can have their own kind of individual exclusivity of an identity. And so that's what I would lean more towards, a notion of privileging the more experimental, the more critical, the more conceptual, the less streamable, or the less big budget, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So did you end up teaching experimental film, or you've never pursued that?
I did teach for a little bit. I taught at Carleton College in St. Olaf and a little bit at Iowa while I was there.
Okay. So what are the services and disservices of marginalizing experimental film? Jackson Pollock was on the cover of Life magazine in 1949. Regular folks could start developing an aesthetic on experimental painting. There was no Bruce Conner or Maya Derens on Life magazine covers. Generally, it's privileged, entitled, I call them rich art kids, who develop an art avant-garde aesthetic and dominate the experimental film world. Any comment?
No, I agree with that. Although I feel like at this point also you could put in the caveat that it also seems like professors dominate the experimental film,
Yeah, hello.
which is its own form of design. What is that? There's like a, what is it? Design obsolescence,
Oh, design obsolescence. I love that.
which is a term typically used to describe cell phones, right? Where the like plug-in is only for an iPhone and gets remodeled every year.
Yeah.
So, you know, that's how I feel about that whole thing. But in general, yeah, I mean, it's a really confusing, it's a confusing and complicated for me subject, or like I'm not a professor. I don't know if I want to be a professor. I tried it. It was nice. But there's a huge amount of limitations that are involved with it in terms of being a practicing artist, even at the level of art, just the way in which articulation happens. But it's like marginal spaces are incredibly ripe, you know, and marginal spaces are incredibly like delicious, and the ways in which they get to exist outside of a dominant gaze or a dominant attention span, right? And so I feel very conflicted in trying to sort of convey to someone that there's a real form of liberation, again, to use that word, that happens when something gets to exist in an area of margin, like in an area outside of the center, in an area of marginalization, especially when it comes to like an artistic practice. So like anyone can pick up a camera and make a film, and I know how like frustrating that phrase can sound to certain people. But I don't know. There's something that's really nice about being able to make work that you get to choose how it engages with the public. And project by project, you can decide how much you want to step into a kind of field that's more dominant and wrapped up in money and wrapped up in attention and wrapped up in a particular centrality, right? Or just make work that's outside of that, that has a lot more freedom. Yeah.
Yeah. I love your word freedom there. And it's, you also evoked a great word phrase, center without margins. But you really nailed it because, you know, design obsolescence.
I know, right?
Now there's a genre of film that are like film festival made. They're made for film festivals. In the professor thing, don't get me started because
Oh,
all
yeah.
Ann Arbor for so long is like they all become a clone of their teacher, and usually their first film that's totally the clone of their teacher is their best film. And it's a sad, you know, and I look at it's just this whole thing. I learned of a art teacher at Cal Arts. They said he doesn't teach as well as he can because his students will take his potential gallery space. You know,
God, it's terrible.
no, it sounds terrible. And I'd ask other people, and they go, "Well, that's in every profession." But you know, the English teachers,
Sure.
they're you know, and then like experimental filmmakers, they're going to teach their. It's just like, but I'm not saying it
Right, right,
happens.
right.
These are just things that came up. But I'm glad you brought up the word gaze because I want to touch on this just briefly. But you know, if you haven't seen Being Natural about Alice Guy Blanchet, she's she invented narrative cinema with Méliès and got blackballed out of cinema history. And she's an amazing filmmaker. And you have to hear this. Have you ever heard of this woman? Okay, check this out. At 8 years old, Eisenstein saw her film and ripped off the image that made him famous. You know, ripped off whatever. You know, the bullet going into the eyeglass, the Potemkin step scene. And
Wow.
so this woman's really important. And this woman made a pretty powerful doc on saying we need to acknowledge this. But then there's another doc that came out by Nina Menkins called Brainwashed, and it tackles the female gaze. And
Yeah.
I understand that with Laura Morvey in 1972's essay. But if I go back, I'm just going to lay this out quickly, but I love your feelings. Is like, so Alice is making films at 130 years ago. 100, is she influenced by her gaze, her framing,
Mm,
because she saw male photographers and male painters? It wasn't like the females dominated that mediums before her.
mm,
Or does she indeed have a female gaze? And is there indeed a male gaze? Or is there just a human gaze? And
mm.
is that invented? My friend insists that we invented the human eye contact because we look at our mother's eyes and then we see her breast and we get milk. So we love to look into the eyes to get our get nurtured.
Yeah.
So just your thoughts on this whole idea of human gaze and eye contact.
I mean, for me, it's like I would want. I think it gets into this larger conversation of the difference between making films and reading films, right? And so I think I'd be curious to know how this filmmaker referred to herself and how she considered herself as a practicing filmmaker or artist and what language she used. And if there was a gendered language to it, then, there we are, like simple as
Yeah.
that. Right? But if she resists that, as other, female filmmakers have resisted the notion of being a feminist or female filmmaker as well, Chantal Ackerman, right? I think there's also something to be considered there as well. So for me, it's like, I'm not so interested in thinking about this relationship to cinema where we only consider the interpretation of it from the outside. I'm a filmmaker. I'm not a scholar. I'm not a critic, and I'm not a programmer. And so I'm more interested in sort of the internal mechanisms of this person, or of this filmmaker, and how they consider themselves. And I'm just not that interested in what people 130 years ago or later decide to sort of place on top of that.
Yeah. Really well put. I mean, that's amazing to just say, I'm not a scholar, I'm not a programmer, I'm not a curator. I mean, you've dabbled in your own way,
Sure.
but the beauty of it is that that's fine that exists. But it's almost like, to me, you're being
Yeah.
more pure because it's like you can't avoid it. It's like every star in Ann Arbor is always a professor,
Yeah.
and then they go, well, I learn a lot from my students too, and that's all good.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that was good. Now, framing aesthetic, because you brought up the word framing early on, I wanted to ask you this. Where did you get your framing aesthetic from? Your sense of framing?
Hmm.
What helped develop that for you?
Um, um, I did practice photography a lot, so that was something that I always enjoyed doing. So I think that's a part of it. I really, as like a lot of early filmmakers, was obsessed with Andrei Tarkovsky, and he has such a clear intentional aspect to his compositions. And so I feel like in some respects I learned what control was by watching his films, and then trying to perform a similar kind of intense control. And then it's sort of, I don't know. So it's a combination of these different kind of nodes that I've hit on. I've learned how to let go, and be more like into a lack of control from various experimental filmmakers. Like I've always been inspired by the kind of non-consideration of the frame by certain diary filmmakers like Danny Restack and Sheila Restack, and other forms of ambiguous relationships to the frame, like the diary work of I can't remember her name off the top of my head. She used to be married. Oh, this is a terrible way of framing her, but she used to be married to P. Adam Sidney. What's her name? I can't remember.
Wow, because there's an amazing thing here. P. Adam Sidney's wife died because
Yeah.
it's the wife that died
Yeah.
because she mixed decongestants with grapefruit juice before they knew it would kill you.
Oh, I didn't know that's how she died.
Oh my God. I'm going to look that up. Because you'll freak. This is funny. I said all these questions I asked P.M. Sidney many years ago. And I says,
Yeah.
what's your favorite form of information? You know, the second question I asked you, you know what he
Yeah.
said? Pillow talk.
Oh, that's sweet.
Oh, it's really sweet because he was hungry for it because his wife had died and he
Yeah.
didn't get pillow. I mean, pillow talk is an amazing form of information, but to
Yeah.
frame it with those two words, you know,
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
I understand what you're saying. And it really,
Marjorie, I think that's her name.
yeah, I'll look it up. We can look it
Yeah.
up, but that's good.
Her
And how
work
do you,
is amazing. Yeah. So it's these different
how do
nodes that sort of like taught me how to play with a frame.
yeah, how do you spell Danny and Sheila's last name?
Well, Danny used to go by Danny Leventhal, now goes by Danny Restack, and it's Restack.
Okay, thank you. So then, well, I wanted to just interject. When I asked Bruce Bailey this question in Ann Arbor years ago, he said, I'll go with Jean Cocteau. He says, I learned how to frame by the way you put your silverware, your knife and fork on the table.
That's nice.
So again, another stupid question, but I'm curious. My friend says the three tenets of music are taste, theory, and technique. So just in regards to what you gravitated towards, I mean, somehow you gravitated towards P.T. Anderson and Terrence Malick. You know, that's a good space to, rather than, you know, Lucas and Spielberg early on. And so we know where someone gets technique. You go, you learn which buttons to push. You know how to understand theory, the techniques of storytelling. How does one acquire taste even in experimental film or taste in film? How does one acquire
Right.
that?
I don't know. I used to, I don't know. It's like, I like, I feel like it's like, this is where I like, I've been thinking recently about how we need to bring back the notion of like the cool artist who's like, where it's like cool to be an outsider artist again, as opposed to like an artist that makes $1 million or whatever. Where I feel like to some degree, I feel like I was influenced by a combination of searching, right, for this impossible thing that reflected a state of emotion that I was in. So that's on the one hand. It's like taste is developed by a pursuit of meaning for me.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I feel like there's an ego involved with it too, where it was like I wanted to be cool and I was interested in like who the cool people were. And it was, I had a register of what was cool and what wasn't cool. And, in a certain community that like can help me, that helped set me on certain paths that helped me, So it's kind of interesting, That's I was thinking about that recently.
It's very interesting. Just hang out in the lobby in the Ann Arbor Film Festival. It's like,
Yeah.
it's all cliquish, but it's all good. I'm not criticizing it. It's everything's cliquish, And the funny thing about experimental filmmakers, there's only like 100 of us across the country, or 200, and it's like
I know.
and it is like, and then you start selling your DCPs in art galleries for 10 grand. It's like, that's the, I mean, it really happened. And I've talked to big time experimental filmmakers who sort of like it because it's nice. No, Phil Solomon was the best. He goes, I'm a professional experimental filmmaker. And I goes, yeah, you got shown at Sundance once and you teach. Yeah, right. No,
There we
but
go.
then he was, because when he died, he got a third of a page of an obituary in New York Times. It's like, finally, when they die, a few
Yeah.
experimental filmmakers get their due. They get an obit in the New York Times. It's like, oh,
And you know what? Can I be a contrarian and say, like, maybe that's okay?
I think it's totally okay. I think it's great. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't. I mean, I mean, Phil's got his due in a way. He was looked up to, and I think it's great. I'm an obituary
No, no, no,
freak.
no.
But
It's not necessarily about Phil or anything. It's like, maybe it's okay that filmmakers, like, they don't really make that many films, or like there aren't known, and then they do get like a paragraph in an obit in New York Times only when they're dead, and only the few, like, maybe that's okay. Like,
oh,
maybe.
I look,
Yeah.
yeah. No, I understand. And Schrader said it well. Well, there's two of these. I'll tell you. One is Schrader said, the role of the artist is to attempt to sell out but fail.
Sure. Well, I
But
disagree, but
yeah, right. You disagree, but it's like, oh, I'm so cool. I tried to sell out, but I'm so pure that I fail. And the other one
right.
is don't sell out, sneak in.
Ooh, that's a good one too. I relate to that one
That's
more.
that's a real good one. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I talked to Michael Apted 40 years ago. He made a documentary on a Russian rock star, and I said, and this was right when MTV was breaking. I says, why do rock video makers feel so obliged to edit fast? Most people don't know Abel Gance invented rapid montage in 1922, but it really flourished in the 80s with MTV, to the point where Marty Scorsese says, I cut my films faster because of MTV. He
Hmm.
said, because we can take in information faster. So I asked this question with a bias: can we literally learn to take in information faster, or are we just brainwashed to believe we can?
Hmm. Yeah, I think we can take in information faster, but I think, like, only certain kinds of information. I think there's like direct experience feels like something that's a form of intelligence that you will never be able to speed up, right? You can't like speed up, the like amount of times you've been dumped or fallen in love, right? That's like something that's impossible to take in over the course of a week versus many years. But information like Wikipedia page articles or biographical information, yeah, I think that's something that humans will evolve to learn quicker.
Can humans literally multitask?
I think they can. I'll be a contrarian and say that I think, to some degree, I think we can.
Yeah. No, that's 50. No, I'd say more like 60-80% say we can.
Oh, really? That's good to hear.
Yeah. Carl, what was the motive of the cave artist? Not what Herzog stole from the New Yorker article, or what anthropologists say. Your hunch, your guess.
I mean, they're probably super bored, and they like had a thing that made a mark, and then they followed the mark. I feel like
That's good.
boredom was a big part of it.
It's good. Yeah, I like Aborigines in Australia have no word for boredom. So does that mean they never get bored, or that's just some other sort of mood they get into and they don't call it boredom?
Right, totally.
What's more important, conviction or compromise?
I guess I would say compromise. I mean, that's generally where my MO has been, is in compromise. Except, again, with film, this is where, you're slowly sort of teasing out my differences between talking as a person or a filmmaker, or thinking about reality versus representation. With filmmaking, I have complete conviction. It's like control and down to the smallest details is what really gets me going, right? But in Carl Human mode, it's way more about compromise. And so again, this is where I like representational spaces, because they allow me to do this thing called control, and I get to sort of tease out all of my fantasies and explore all of my ideas in a way that I totally feel like I can control and be intentional with, but don't want to do in reality. And in fact, actively resist doing in reality, or would never do in my day-to-day life.
Really well put, Carl. I really appreciate this. Now, how do you rate these elements in your accomplishments? Luck, skill, and ambition. What played the biggest role, second and third?
Probably luck. It's like being a charmer. Is charming a skill? I guess charm is a skill. So probably luck, skill, ambition.
Cool. T.S. Eliot said poetry is outing your inner dialogue. What language is your inner dialogue in?
Mm. Mm. I'm going to pass on that one.
I got to tell you, Abigail Childs, she said, what language is your inner dialogue in? She goes, I wish I knew. I love that answer.
That's kind of how I feel. I'm more along those lines.
That's fine. George Manupelli's mantra was ignore yourself. Jonas Mekas says there is no self-expression. And Cecil Taylor, great jazz pianist, says, I'm just a vehicle and this stuff just comes through me. Is art making more self-expression, or more you're a vehicle for whatever technology, culture, or environments are dominant?
Yeah, I see if I align to anything, it's closer to the notion of a vehicle. I mean, and I like that metaphor too, right? Because like there still needs to be a driver, right? And so it's like I feel very much that there's an energy that moves through me. I feel very much that in all of my years of pursuing and perfecting a practice, it's to tune into something and listen and show up and continue to show up. But I also feel like, there's like a driver at this vehicle that's like, at least, if not like totally in control of where the vehicle is going, is like making micro adjustments here and there.
It's really good. And again, I compliment you because you really get what I'm after. I'm after inventing new questions and new metaphors. You'd be amazed. No one's ever brought up that simple idea that a vehicle needs a driver.
Yeah, right.
That's really interesting. But the hidden question really is can art making be egoless?
No, I don't think so. Not for me. At least not for me.
Okay. Is perception reality?
No. No, I don't think so.
Why is it so difficult for humans to consider the possibility that life may be pointless? I'm not saying it is. I'm saying, why is it hard for us to consider the possibility that it might be pointless?
I feel like it's a lot easier to consider it being pointless if we give up the whole God thing, right? So I think to some degree it comes down to a simple notion of that religion has been too thoroughly instilled in us, specific forms of religion.
Yeah. Moshe Feldenkrais works with healing and movement. He says it's literally possible to identify a weakness and incorporate it to become a strength, rather than we're normally taught to overcome a weakness. Tell me a weakness you turned into a strength.
I um I really am not a super huge fan of shooting like film. And I think I really, really, really tried my hardest to do that. And I think I've realized that I've like learned to work more in ways that allow me to have a lot more freedom in the edit, as opposed to sort of finding control through the camera. And I think that's like this negotiation that's happened where I thought I was going to be a filmmaker like Tarkovsky, where you have these long shots of control. And I'm more along as a filmmaker like, you know, Marker or Child, since you brought up Abigail Child, where the power is in the edit.
Yes. Amazing. And even, you take it to documentary filmmakers now, they claim written by, because the editing is the writing. So that's good. You tackled this early on, but I'm going to ask it anyways. You create what you resist. It's a saying. Bob Goldthwait morphed it into "you are what you hate." James Joyce said it's a curious thing how your mind is super saturated with the religion in which you say you disbelieve. And Louis Buñuel nailed it. He said, "Thank God I'm an atheist." So how do you process this line, "you create what you resist"? And I don't mean you, but just in general, one creates what one resists.
I agree. I mean, I sort of said it before, right? It's like, I think, especially those of us who like have marginalized sexualities or gender expressions or whatever, it's like, I think we learn through opposition at first. And I think that we become very adept at doing that. And so I was, again, if we're talking about that weakness question too, right?
Yeah.
Very, very good at perceiving the things that I hate as a means of controlling a sense of myself. And I think I've learned how to turn that into a huge strength because it's a feeling. And that feeling, regardless of what it is indicating something. And usually that thing is significant. So yeah, I would 100%. I mean, there's other feelings as well that could be aligned with that statement, but resistance is a really powerful one because it means that, it's your body is like having a direct experience or an encounter.
Very good. Anger can be a productive emotion when fill in the blank.
I don't, anger can be a productive emotion when it's needed, maybe I'll just end it there, when it's needed.
Fine. How do you find peace of mind?
I find peace of mind by needing to be alone quite a lot and slowing down. I meditate. I'm a meditator. I go on super long hikes, and those are in nature, like coming up from my like roots, camping, hiking, nature, alone, meditation. Yeah, that's how I find peace of mind.
Beautiful.
Which I guess sort of indicates peace of mind for me is a place where I feel like I have the space to know how I feel or the space to know what I want. And I only arrive at those situations when I have enough time that I'm alone,
Yeah.
That's what peace of mind is to me. Yeah.
If you were walking down the street today, Carl, and you met yourself as a 12-year-old, what would you say to your 12-year-old self?
Aw. I'd say, you got this, kiddo. That's what I would say.
That is good. You got this, kiddo. That is a great line. I want that line. Here's quick. We got about 10 more minutes. I really appreciate this, Carl. Really, really fun. And I really learned a lot. Thank you so much. These are 5 Alan Watts questions just off the top of your head in a couple words. Who started it all?
Um, no one.
Are we going to make it?
No.
Where do we put it?
Somewhere.
Who's cleaning it up?
Us all.
Is it serious?
Yes.
Very good. Which way, the end of the Alan Watts, which way should toilet paper come off the roll, over or under?
Always over.
Why?
Because it's easier to tear that way.
If a publisher was to release your autobiography off the top of your head, what would the title be?
A long pause.
They want the glue in the binding. What smell would it be?
Say that again.
They want to scent the glue in the binding of your autobiography. What smell would it be?
What's the name of that flower? Geranium.
Geranium.
Yeah.
Beautiful. If a statue was built in your honor, where would you want it displayed and what would it be made of?
It would be displayed somewhere in Maine and most likely in a small town in the interior of the state instead of on the coastline. And it would be made of granite.
Tell me something. Very good. Tell me something good you never had and you never want.
I never want to go on a honeymoon.
It's good. You never had it and you never want it. That's good. Never had that answer. If you were in a vat of vomit up to your neck and someone threw a bag of shit at your face, what would you do?
Open my mouth.
Whoa! What's the cultural shift you see developing today that inspires you?
If we're thinking about the sense of the word inspiring, where it's also there's some fear in it as well, then I would say that I'm inspired by this growing and afraid of this like growing sense that experimental filmmaking and nonfiction cinema are becoming one and the same in documentary filmmaking, where it feels like more and more they're being considered within the same realms and in the same spaces and for the same grants and for the same fellowships and by the same institutions and at a relatively same level.
Wow. What can you give me an example of a film or a maker or
I mean, we all know many of these different filmmakers. Like we've all gone to school with them. You know, there's like Sky Hopinka is a really great example of a filmmaker. Okay. He's like a very obvious example. Okay.
But is it?
But these filmmakers,
like Craig Baldwin's
yeah, sure.
Tribulation '99? Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And I think these spaces are like more open to considering Craig Baldwin within the same space as Sky Hopinka's new films or whatever. You know what I mean? There's like this sort of a blurring that's happening between this thing that we used to call experimental film and this thing that had an umbrella term like nonfiction.
Yeah. It's good. Just a couple more. Louis Bersani studied Mallarmé's poetry. He said, "The very crises which threatens the writing of poetry sustains poetic composition." For some reason, that resonated with how you explained resistance early on. And I was curious if that has any you have any thoughts on that. The very crises which threatens the writing of poetry sustains poetic composition.
Yeah, I mean, I 100% agree with that. It's like for filmmaking, I'm afraid of my projects. I mean, they're always so huge. I mean, the experiences are so intense, and it's always such a huge like undertaking to sort of decide to truly take on another project. So I feel like I kind of forget what he was saying, but it is like I kind of resist making art because I know that it's going to be such an intense process. So, and that way, I think there's this respect, fear, resistance, and submission, or fall into this thing called making art.
Well, I appreciate that, Carl, because it seems you're being bare bones honest with me. It's sort of like you could just, most people, I love to make art and it inspires people. And, I really make my living and art is so art.
None of that.
And, I'm curious, where did you get that from? The way your parents raised you, on your own? How did that come about in you?
What?
That sense of that,
No.
that resistance is part of your process. You're almost saying, I dread making my film, but in deep down inside, you like to make films and you continue to make films. It's
Mm-hmm.
not like you said, I've tried that and I'm not going to do that.
Right.
So there's something in it that you see yourself continuing to do that,
Mm-hmm.
but you're tackling fear, you're tackling all, you're integrating all these you're navigating, integrating, whatever you want to say.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm asking you, where do you think you got that from? Do you find that your peers, do you find filmmakers say that same thing, or it seems that you're unique in that regard?
I don't know. I mean, I think I have almost more friends who aren't filmmakers. They're more like writers and poets, and I feel like the writers and poets that I know sort of say that. So
They
I
say that, yeah,
that it's a kind of resistance, or they sort of dread it, especially my painter friends, because they know. I mean, it's so intense. There's nothing
yeah,
quite like the existential dread of not knowing what the next move you should do with the project. It's literally the worst.
yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah. But with, I think in my field too, it depends. It depends. If the person is like making films that are truly real films, yeah, I think they all sort of feel a similar way. If they're making films that are Sundance films or whatever big film festival films that are, filling out the boxes on a grant application, I think there's a little bit of a different sense of the filmmaking process.
Yeah. So just two more. Thanks again, Carl. Here's the biggie that you already answered three times, but I'm going to ask it anyways. I think you'll appreciate the quotes. Joseph Boyce said, "Make the secrets productive." Lou Welsh, ad man and a poet, said, "Guard the secrets, constantly reveal them." But it was Ford and Wilder, 1928. Art is confession. Art is the secret told. But art is not only the desire to tell one's secret, it's the desire to tell it and hide it at the
Oh yeah.
same time. I mean,
100.
do you know that quote?
No, I don't.
That's amazing because you
Yeah.
actually almost said it word for
Yeah.
word early on. And I was like, this is too much. So this
Yeah.
is how I usually follow that with, which is totally stupid, but I'm going to say it anyways.
Yeah.
Carl, you've laid your cards on the table for 90 minutes. I'm not insinuating you haven't already answered this, but what's it really all about for you?
Um, I think I've told you from the beginning. A pretty open book here. There's not much to hide. That's the tricky thing about secrets that I feel like no one tells you is that they it's not like a thing that you are like actively avoiding or actively resisting or actively like mitigating. They just
Yeah.
are. Secrets just are. And you
Yeah.
can learn to sort of be with them, and you can learn to sort of explore them and tap into them, but they're not like a concrete thing, you know? So there's no reason to sort of, I don't know, hide, you know, because they're
Yeah.
already hidden, whether you want to or not.
It's really well put. You sussed it out. 'Cause I remember when I first started asking that question, one guy says, no, I would say, do you have any secrets? So it's
Yeah,
a redundant thing. If it's a secret, I'm not going to tell you. And he says, yeah, don't tell my wife I smoked a cigarette this morning.
yeah. That's a good one too.
And it's like secrets are not a thing. That's a good one there.
They're not a thing. Or just like, at least I'm more interested in the secrets that we don't know. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's what we study is basically these hidden psychic effects, these things that it's like you're a deep sea diver. You can, and you might not find it, but you can pursue it, and it doesn't mean you have to find it. So
Yeah.
thanks again, Carl. The last question is, what gives you the most optimism?
Hmm. Humans do, weirdly enough.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's being in New York City, it can make you feel like an optimist.
Yeah. Check this out. The first question is, what's the best thing for a human being? I got that from someone who studied Wilhelm Reich, and the
Mhm.
answer is for them is another human being. The
Yeah.
last the last question, what gives you the most optimism, is the question they asked Groucho Marx at the end of his life. And he
Mm,
said, what gives you the most optimism? He said, other people.
mm.
So you hit it out of the ballpark, Carl. You got all the answers right. Go to the
I'm a
top of the class.
humanist, sticking through. Sounds
Yeah,
like you're a
you
fellow humanist.
it sounds like what?
Sounds like you're a fellow humanist, you know? I'm a
Yeah,
humanist sticking through.
yeah. Anyways, thank you so much, Carl. I'm going to hit the end broadcast button, but I hope our discussion never ends.
Yeah, this was great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Carl.